All right, ladies and gentlemen, science is with your digital science teacher today. Please make sure you have everything that you need. That's going to be this worksheet here. We're going to put some notes in there. We're going to then have it glued in on page 55. So you're going to need your notebooks, something to write with, and glue. Please make sure that you follow along. You don't fall asleep because I will be stamping and grading these when I get back. Major evidence for evolution. That is what our notes are about, and that's what each of these items are. They're evidence of evolution, and that is the fossil record, the homologous structures that we had our activity on before, vestigial structures, I talked a little bit about that one, genetic evidence, and embryological evidence. All of these support Darwin. You remember this guy? He was on the Beagle, not the dog, the boat. And he had a whole lot of discoveries, and one of them was about some finches. We had our South American mainland finch and all of these other finches that were found on the islands around, and they adapted to their surroundings. Most adapted based on their food and predators. Their color was more for the predators and their beak shape for the food. Darwin had a gigantic theory about that, and he called it natural selection. It is also proof of evolution. So the theory of evolution by natural selection is that you're going to have several generations of a species that are going to have differences. And those variations that let them survive the best at getting food, the best at getting mates, the best at not becoming prey, those are the ones that are going to survive to the next generation. And that is going to then be passed on to their offspring. If the individual doesn't have offspring, then that trait doesn't get passed on. Those variations are controlled by genes, and the individual organisms don't have any control over that, most unfortunately. They can't decide to be gorgeous and attract a mate, and they cannot decide, ooh, worms are going to be way easier to get than hacking away at a tree to get a bug buried deep inside. Unfortunately, organisms have to work with what they have, so there is no way they can make a conscious control over that. The variations are not always passed on. Most unfortunately, sometimes those variations get lost. It's not that frequent, but it does happen. And unfortunately, variations that are not useful may also be passed on. Those are things that happen either due to mutations or other unfortunate events, and the passing on, because it is genetic, does happen. The first that we really want to focus on is the fossil record. If you're following along, that's going to be right here at the top. Fossil evidence. So why is fossil evidence important? Well, the fossil record, all of those fossils we found in our sedimentary rock, show the time period and the order that the organisms lived in. You can see here they've color-coded it, and these are the different time periods and what organisms lived in those time periods. This gives a timeline for how the organisms evolved. This part here you probably haven't heard of before, and it's huge. Transitional forms. Transitional forms are a really big deal because those transitional forms are the organisms that are not common today. They are those links between what we had found previously and what is alive today. Fossils are easily destroyed. We talked about the rock cycle and the fact that if a rock undergoes heat, pressure, or erosion, the rock is then destroyed and creates a new rock. Fossils are basically a type of rock. They're just very special rock because they are the remains of organisms that lived a long time ago. That having been said, they are still susceptible to all those things from the rock cycle that destroy rock. If we had a particularly short time period, like here, that's pretty short, it's actually split between two, it would be very hard to find organisms in those rock layers, especially with weathering, erosion, and all of the damage, meaning there could be a gap in the fossil record. Those transitional forms if they are in one of those gaps in the fossil record, were what a lot of scientists had problems with when it came to Darwin's theory of evolution. They felt that there should not be any gaps whatsoever, that if it was evolution, all of the evidence for those organisms were going to be easily found. It wasn't until decades later, in some cases, that certain transitional organisms were found. Here's an example we have for the horse. This is the most recent. Each of these was from a different time period, and each was found in the fossil record and not necessarily found in order and not necessarily found within the same decade. For your notes, fossil evidence gives the time based on the location of the rock layers, order living things came in, and their transitional forms. Again, what you need to write specifically is that it gives the time based on location in rock layers, order living things came in, and their transitional forms. If you still need time to write, pause the video. Now we're at homologous structures. We spent a long time on these before, and you probably recognize them a little better like this, where we have the different hands, paws, wings, and flippers. And the structure of the bones inside of each is extraordinarily similar. And that body structure is similar and having a different function, but all due to a common ancestor. The common ancestor was a very long time ago for some, compared to others, because of how different the development is through evolution. Again, that's because of a common ancestor. So what do we put in our notes? Common structure is an inherited trait and proof of a common ancestor. Common structure is an inherited trait and proof of a common ancestor. Now we have moved on to the vestigial structures. These are structures that have absolutely no function for the current organism, but had a useful function for an ancestor, like ear muscles. Ear muscles in an ancestor to a human more than likely helped that organism hear by being able to turn the ear or adjust the ear to be able to pinpoint sounds and noises. Humans have no such need. We also have the appendix. If you take a look, it's just at the very end here of the intestine, and it serves absolutely no purpose for the human being. It is thought that when humans were more eating of grasses and harder to digest materials, that the intestines needed to be longer so that the human could then digest grasses. Now, grasses are something that are super hard to digest. If you don't know, cows have more than one stomach to help them digest grass. So back when humans hadn't become such great hunters and gatherers, they had a need to be able to digest things that were much more difficult. And you've probably heard about the tailbone, the coccyx. Some people believe that it is evidence that humans once had tails. Now, our notes. So for vestigial structures, you're going to say that it is a structure that serves no purpose, no function, but was once helpful to the ancestor. One more time, structure that serves no function, but was once helpful to an ancestor. If you need more time, pause the video. Now we have moved on to embryological development. So an embryo, for those of you who do not know, is merely a fertilized egg. And this is in the process of growing into a new organism, a new individual. And the part that is pretty weird and trippy is it almost looks like an alien. Wait till you see the next slide, it's creepy. So the closely related organisms go through similar developmental stages in their early development. Where it gets creepy, all vertebrates, that means everything with a backbone, is going to have a gill pouch at some time in their embryonic development. And this is what is really creepy. They all look like they're some sort of an alien, don't they? But you'll notice the fish, the salamander, the tortoise, the chicken, the pig, the cow, the rabbit, and the human all look amazingly similar as an embryo, and that is because of common ancestry. So, ladies and gentlemen, our notes: related organisms go through similar embryo development. Related organisms go through similar embryo development. If you need more time to write, please hit pause. Molecular DNA evidence. Really, this is genetic evidence or DNA evidence, and you have probably heard of testing for paternity or testing to see who's related to who, or even ancestry testing. They advertise that on TV a lot. And at its simplest, the more genetic code you share with another organism, the more closely you are related. What has become truly amazing is as the more science goes into genetic science and testing and finding out about the genome and genetics, the more we are proving evolution. All organisms on the planet share the same amino acid set to create this code, this genetic code. When you get more closely related, the actual sequence of those acids become more and more similar, and some practically identical, and that's how you can tell that organisms are extremely closely related. You can take a look here. They've got some of the base codes, and all of these make up a protein sequence. So that would be one of these little crossbars in the genes. None of this would have been possible without scientific advancements, and it all proves Darwin's theory from the 1800s. So what on earth do we need to put there? Well, we need to put the more genetic similarities organisms have, the more closely related they are. And yes, I know it's spelled wrong. If you give me a second, I will do a spell check. There you go. So please make sure you get all of this in your notes. If you need more time, absolutely, please pause the video and get those notes in. All right, ladies and gentlemen, for our next section, you are going to need this handout. If you don't have it, please get it. You're going to fill in each of these sections. It's a low-rent Venn diagram. No circles, all rectangles. And we're going to fill it in together. Hopefully, if you pay attention, you'll have a nice A. This one will be turned into the box and graded and returned to you before it gets glued into the notebook. This one's going to be a little more difficult, so you're going to want to make sure that you pay more attention than ever before, because each of these are going to come over here, and if you don't pay attention, you're most definitely not going to find the right spot. All right, ladies and gentlemen, this one is natural selection versus selective breeding. Selective breeding is also called artificial selection because the selection was made artificially, not naturally. Big idea. Natural selection is a process by which organisms that are most suited for the environment survive and they reproduce. This is the nature, no human interference. On the opposite side, selective breeding, or artificial selection, is a method of breeding that only allows desired traits to be produced in the next generation or is chosen for artificially, and it is done by humans. If you have been paying attention at all, then you are more than aware that we've already got some information we can put on our chart. The first of which is the fact that it is a genetically inherited trait. You see, both of these, both natural selection and artificial selection, the selective breeding, require an inherited trait. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is going to go for both. So you're going to write out traits are genetically inherited right here in the middle. One of the next ones we have is that the environment is what influences survival. And I'm not going to tell you. You're going to decide. Is that natural selection or artificial? Does the environment decide what is most beneficial? And I think this time you're actually going to need to pause so that you've got plenty of time to write. And what are you writing? Well, over on the side, you actually have right here, the environment influences survival. And you're going to put it on your T-chart underneath natural selection or artificial selection where it goes. Okay, moving on just a little bit. All of this comes from Darwin. All of this comes from natural selection and proof of evolution. Evolution obviously is a gradual change. We talked about this being in fossil record and evidence being found hundreds of millions of years ago, it seems. Well, it was at least millions of years ago. And it is a slow process. And if you're paying attention, that's right, that's one more we need to add to our chart. So right here we have that it happens slowly over time, and it belongs over here with natural selection. So you're going to need to write in this column, happens slowly over time. If you need more time, pause the video. So natural selection is about an organism being better adapted for the environment. And here you can see that the bird can easily see our green bug, and lo and behold, there's no green bugs to pass on that inherited trait. We have no green bugs. And that's right here. Selected trait improves an organism's chance to survive and reproduce. So this time you need to put on the side underneath of the correct box, natural selection or artificial selection. Selected trait improves an organism's chance to survive and reproduce. Now remember, I'm not giving you the answer, and you're going to need to figure that out for yourself. Which box is it going to go in? If you need more time, pause the video. The next that we're going to put on our chart is right here, that it improves an organism's fitness. And improving an organism's fitness is it's going to be better adapted, better able to survive. That means it's going to be able to survive overproduction, adaptations, competition for food, competition for any type of resource, place to live, mates. So ladies and gentlemen, again, I'm not going to give you the answer, what column that it goes in. You're going to need to figure that out for yourself. But what you are filling in is that it increases an organism, improves an organism's fitness, meaning it increases its chance to survive. And you're going to need to put that in the correct section. Pause the video if you need more time to write. Variation is the last here, and while it is absolutely required for natural selection, it is also absolutely required for artificial selection. Artificial selection, you cannot breed for a trait that you want your animal to have, your organism to have, if that trait isn't already inside the genetic code. So we now have one more we can fill in, and that is process that changed traits in a living species from one generation to the next. Well, that wasn't what I was looking for, but that definitely sounds like both artificial and natural selection. So if you don't have that in there, let's make sure you do, because I think that was our first one. And I found it. It's at the bottom. Require diversity or variation of traits. So diversity or variation of traits is going to go for both. Please make sure it goes in your both column and get that written in. Again, that was diversity or variation of traits. It is required for both. In our example here for the dogs, they started with the wolf. Some dogs were bred for the long haul, for durability, and for cold weather. Others were bred to get underneath bushes and to ferret out any kind of bird or wild game for hunters. Others were actually created by humans to point out game and to fetch it back to them. All of those traits are not possible without already being present in the original species. The same can be said with our natural selection. So both artificial and natural selection require variation in order to be a possibility. Mutations are something I slipped by pretty fast and I have come back to now because mutations are not necessarily natural or artificial, but they are both. They are not something that you're going to need to take your notes on, but they are something you're going to need to be aware of. Mutations can cause damage to the genetic sequence that kills the organism, or it can simply make an alteration to the genetic sequence. If the genetic sequence has been altered, it does pass on to the organisms. Selective breeding, artificial selection, is about human influence on behavior, and that is going to be another one of ours that we need to fill in. And that is going to be traits desirable to breeders. Breeders are the humans. If you want to change breeder to human, that's fine, but that does go here underneath artificial selection. Artificial selection is also much faster than natural selection. Take a look at my golden doodle and my puggle. Designer breeds, or mutts, definitely a question to think about, but these designer breeds are possible within a generation. This crossbreed does not create an entirely new species because they're both still dogs, but these hybrids happen super fast compared to natural selection, and it is strictly based on what the human chooses. Unfortunately, those human choices are not always good for the organism. They can decrease an organism's fitness. So that's an artificial selection. They decrease an organism's fitness. And if you don't believe me, take a look at this guy. Do you think this particular organism would survive on its own in the wild? Look at that coloring. If that does not stand out to you, I don't know what will. Obviously, it's not going to survive in nature. One of the other reasons, the main reasons besides the traits are beneficial to man due to they want a specific puggle to cuddle, is take a look. This is the original species for corn. And you see how tiny those little kernels are and how small of an amount there is? And now here we have modern corn. That's a quarter, and that's a quarter. There's a whole lot more food here. Artificial selection, while it does not improve survival in the wild, it does improve for what a man needs, or what man in general needs. So if you take a look, maize or corn, we increase the oil content, we increase the size of the cob so that it provides more food. Tomatoes, wheat, apples, beans, all of these changes were done by man through selective or artificial breeding, artificial selection, so that there would be a benefit to man. Almost none of these changes benefit the organism. They strictly benefit man. Engineering, genetic engineering, has been around for a while and it is only improving. GMOs, genetically modified organisms, are not always a bad thing. We do talk about it like it's always a bad thing, but if you come back to our corn, if we didn't do a little modifying, a little selective breeding, then we would not have the main food source, corn, that we do. The majority of these that are not done in a lab, they're actually done in a greenhouse. So while it is genetically modifying organisms, they are not being genetically modified in majorly negative ways. They are being selectively bred as they would in nature, but instead of being selectively bred naturally for their environment, they are being selectively bred artificially so that they have a benefit to humans. I believe I did miss one of our word bank sets of phrases that needs to go into the chart. Please make sure you double check and you don't forget them. You do have all of the information necessary to fill it in completely. Make sure that you have your first name, last name, and class period at the top, and that you turn this in. This is going to go in your notebook right next to the notes that we did at the beginning of class, but not until after it has been graded. So again, make sure that this one gets turned in.